experience the, okay. So with question 1, we'll begin. How do you experience the intersection between your racial identity and autism? How you see and feel it within yourself and how you are perceived. In what ways do these identities overlap and interact? Who would like to start with question 1? RJ, could I get you to start?
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, personally for me, I think in the past, I had a lot of conflict, balancing, as in like just, yeah, actually I have a lot of conflict between my racial identity and autism because, firstly, I think my parents, they don't have a good understanding of autism. And so I think it's often very stigmatized in my culture. And yes, I think that racial identity it's inextricably linked to culture, and the stereotypes that it might generate. And so I think for me, I think there are a lot of like East Asian stereotypes. And I think perhaps a lot of people might have trouble differentiating between these stereotypes and autistic traits. And I think from my own experience, I think a lot of these autistic traits are simply attributed to typical Asian stereotypes. And so I think that initially it was difficult to find someone to talk to and someone that was able to differentiate between culture or race and how autism presents itself.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. Caitlin, would you like to add to that, please?
Yes, I can add to that. Thinking about RJ's experience, I think growing up Black in America and in the South, it was almost the opposite, where it seemed like a lot of the white people I was around and teachers didn't seem like they knew like what to do with me or where I fit in. And with a lot of my peers who were Black, like I was known as the weird kid, or I would get, you're book smart, but you're not street smart, and things like that. But I wasn't necessarily, I guess, left out of a lot of groups with my peers who were Black. It was just, I would get called a nerd, or I think I didn't really see representation of myself until Family Matters with Steve Urkel, or even like Carlton standing out in Fresh Prince of like, okay, like we don't necessarily know where you fit in because of the different traits that I had of like how autism shows up with me. Like I was always the odd kid out.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Please forgive me and correct me if I'm mispronouncing your name. Azrael?
Azrael.
Azrael, thank you.
I have a very similar experience, but I grew up in a very predominantly white Protestant neighborhood and community. So I was one of the very few Black kids, and I also grew up Jewish. So that culturally kind of definitely made me a lot different than other people. The way that I was brought up was different. So the cultural touchstones that somebody who may have grown up Christian or white were completely different. So my difficulties were not the same when it came to autism, because um, fast talking or talking a lot isn't seen as like a deficit in those communities. It's not seen as something that like children seen and never heard is a little bit in there, but it's not seen as something so outlandish that a kid might want to just complain about their day and not have anything done, just complain, and that be the end of it, or talk about something that they're really interested in, and that's just completely normal. Whereas a lot of my friends growing up grew up being a lot quieter, or the expectation was for them to be quieter, a little more understanding of what's going on around them consistently. And definitely I was seen as a weird kid, but the reason why I was seen as a weird kid was never specifically autism, but there was definitely that in there because of I didn't conform to stereotypes that other people had for me. I was very different from what people expected of me, and definitely teachers didn't know what to do with me. I could finish a test in no time, but when it came to classes, I was distracted. I didn't want to sit down and listen because it wasn't engaging me in any real way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing. Yadira Morales?
Yes.
Did you want to?
Jackie,
Yes.
I think that the squares have gotten out of order.
Yeah,
for
they
you. You
have.
can't see all the panelists.
No, I can't. I'm sorry, Yadira.
No, that's okay. I will send a separate message to you in the chat with
Okay,
everybody's
so
name.
I think that would be Kaylee then.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, Kaylee, you kind of went down a few rows for me. Thank you, Kaylee. Please, if you could share.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Hopefully my internet connection is stable. I just moved to a new hotel and they promised a fast internet, but promises don't always come true.
Okay, well, you sound good now. Thank you.
Okay, cool. I'm in Rio de Janeiro. But I've actually been traveling Latin America to learn more about autism in Latin America, and my family's from Guatemala and Puerto Rico. And I think there's a lot of stigma around disability, and my parents didn't really have an awareness of autism. I never got a diagnosis and found out as an adult, which is extremely common for, I'm going to use the gender neutral term, Latina people. I've put in the chat, I recorded and made a very long blog post about, Latin American communities and autism. But I think especially for immigrant communities, there's like a shame about like, oh, my child is weak, my child isn't tough enough, I'm a failure as a parent. And this goes back to like the 40s and 50s, like refrigerator parents, but I think the Latin American community hasn't really gotten over that. And then at the same time, like I had to deal with like being taught to be white, my dad's white, I'm multiracial, and like, there was a lot of expectations as a trans person, who was assigned male at birth, to be tough, to suck things up, to not be emotional. So all those things kind of intersected. And my parents were very skeptical of psychiatry and psychology. But in my explorations in Latin America and interviewing, my family in Guatemala and Puerto Rico, my grandfather was pretty clearly autistic, so I looked at him as a role model, even though he was born in the 20s and not diagnosed. For me, sometimes people talk about like gifted and talented programs or like accelerated programs. It's like another type of developmental disability or another kind of developmental difference, because like we're rushed into like, oh, I'm good at science and math and stuff, but have completely horrible social skills and don't know how to relate to people my age. and I feel like my social life was extremely stunted. And it would have been great to know I was neurodivergent or have autistic community or understand that, you know, being disciplined for not looking at people in the eyes, you know, and being, you know, disciplined for being oversensitive or for acting out, you know, was possibly related to being neurodivergent. So, you know, I put a lot of statistics into that video / blog I shared, but I really think that kind of Spanish speaking, Portuguese speaking, Latin American communities are just very behind on understanding autism.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And again, please pardon me for getting you mixed up. I don't want to do that again. For me, my experience has been very interesting. First of all, I was raised in a very abusive situation, so that is very deeply and profoundly woven into my situation. I grew up with older parents, so the being seen and not heard was very prominent, but I always seemed to ignore that. Every opportunity I had to talk to adults, I would take, because I found kids my age to be mind-numbingly boring. I was not into children's games. I wasn't into talking about children's topics. I started reading very, very early. I actually started reading around the age of 2. Interestingly enough, with my parents being who they were, they never really paid that much attention to what I was doing. So they did not know that I knew how to read. And they didn't know that I knew how to read until I was in kindergarten, actually. So I had been reading for at least 2 years by then. I was always very different. But in my community, especially having older family members, I heard conversations about autism briefly when, of course, the movie Rain Man came out, and I overheard 2 elder women asking if they would be, you know, if they should be concerned with such a thing. And the answer was no, because it was thought that it was a white person's situation, and that there were no Black people that were autistic, and so we didn't have to worry about that. I wondered, but I didn't know. That was the first time I ever heard the word autism. So I just embraced being different. I embraced being who I was. And I used every skill set I had to survive the trauma that I was currently going through at the time. So that was my primary focus. So thank you all for sharing for that question. Did anyone else have anything they wanted to add before I go to the next question? Yeah. Okay.
I just want to, I just echo your experience of, I mean, I dealt with abuse, and also I sought out adults. I was very into gaming. I'd go to a game store and I'd play like collectible card games and role playing and tabletop games with like people who were 20s, you know, because as an 11-year-old, I was bullied and seen as too advanced for my age and just didn't relate to kids, you know.
Yeah, same here, same here. I love talking about the brain. That was my big thing, and reading about mental illnesses for some reason. That was a big draw for me as well, maybe because I was kind of living in the midst of it and didn't really realize it. Okay, the second question. Autistic BIPOC, and that's Black, Indigenous, people of color, are more likely to be unidentified or misdiagnosed and have less access to supports and services. African American children on the autism spectrum are 5.1 times more likely to be misdiagnosed with behavior disorders. And in a meta-analysis of over 1,000 autism intervention studies conducted between 1990 and 2017, only 252 of them reported data on the race, ethnicity of their participants. And of those, only 104 included Black African American participants. Only 78 included Hispanic Latino participants, and only 76 included Asian participants. How do you feel your racial identity impacted your autism diagnosis and access to resources? Would you like to start, Caitlin?
Yeah, I can start. Definitely echoing what Jackie and Kaylee shared of um, just growing up, like a lot of people who I was around, like especially elder Black people, like they would say certain things like, oh, that's just for white people, or like that's what white people have to worry about. Um, Coupled with thinking about the history of everything, like you have the Tuskegee experiment, and then that spanned decades. And then at the middle of that, you have the Holocaust. So autism and Asperger's specifically, like already has an ugly ableist and racist history. And then also you see how Black people were treated by psychologists and quote unquote experts. So there's also a mistrust, which is definitely understandable, of the medical community and of psychologists. And so that being in combination with itself, a lot of times, even if Black people might have, at least where I grew up in North Carolina, even if we tended to notice like, oh, something's different about that person, we don't quite know what, but this is what we're trying to make it work. There's not an immediate trust of professionals unless that professional was Black or had some sort of way to build trust with the Black community that was local to me. And so I wasn't diagnosed until last fall. So that was a couple months before my 33rd birthday. And like Kaylee was saying, like that, it would have served me well to know that early on. Similar to what both of you shared, like I mostly talked to teachers in classes. I didn't really talk to my classmates. I would talk to teachers. I would talk to um, the people who worked in other departments at the school, even if they weren't a teacher, but I rarely talked to another peer unless they were similar to me. Um, and so I think because of the history, at least seeing how trends are with Black Americans, I think because of the history of everything and also what's currently happening, like there are still a lot of disparities, especially with poor people, of a diagnosis being a part of systemic racism or a way of keeping someone out of certain services or being able to receive help in a certain way. Um, I think everyone who could be seeking help or services for whatever they're noticing, they're not because of that mistrust too.
It's a very interesting point. RJ, let's go to you. Thank you, Caitlin.
Yeah, I think I guess in my own family, I think, or at least in Asian culture, East Asian culture, I think, because autism is not very well understood, I think, in my own culture, but I think that the people that are sort of exposed to it are the ones that have received some sort of like ABA type of training in autism. And so I think that perhaps their view of autism may not be entirely accurate as a result, and so it brings a lot of stigma. And it's because of, I think it's because of this that autism is so stigmatized in my culture, and just the need to conform to social norms. And so I think that for myself, I think it's hard to find therapists that are perhaps more familiar with Asian culture, especially East Asian, and someone that's able to recognize the experiences of growing up in that culture and how that is distinctly different from like more artistic experiences. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, RJ. And Azrael?
I have a bit of kind of the reverse problem that Caitlin spoke about happening. And similar to what Kaylee said before in the last question, I was in accelerated education throughout most of my elementary and even like middle school years. But I started to burn out hard from all of that because of the expectations, the heaps of homework that was expected while I was trying to cool down from being extremely social and masking during my school day. So I asked for mental health help, which I got at a kind of young age. The problem was I got misdiagnosed, and the problems that they diagnosed were the surface level problems and not the deeper underlying issue. And then they over medicated me on multiple things, including things for psychosis, which I didn't have and didn't actually show signs of. It caused a lot of body problems and their own mental problems. And most of the medications didn't work with my brain chemistry, and they weren't being careful. And I was a teenager. So there's a lot of issues with that. And it took till I was 17 before I was diagnosed with autism. I had an intensive program, which a lot of those, when it comes to teenagers, are incredibly traumatizing. There's not a lot of safeguards for any of those programs to be what they're telling parents that they are. They isolate you from people that care about you. They expect you to act a specific way, which doesn't work for a person who's autistic. They separate you from things that you use to comfort yourself a lot of the time. You're not able to use your phone. You're not able to watch TV for extended periods of time. You're not able to have certain books that they don't deem appropriate for you, despite the fact that your parents telling them that you can have those things.
Right.
And I actually technically diagnosed myself while listening to another person in the program talking about their experience with autism, while the person who's working with me was already talking to my family about the probability of me being autistic.
Okay.
Which is partially why I'm such a big advocate for people self-diagnosing and looking into stuff, because you know your own brain better than anybody else does. And
Right.
especially after years of traumatizing experiences or masking, other people may not see you for what you're actually experiencing in the world.
Right.
Especially if you're not the model of the white cis man that they expect autism to look like.
Right. Right. Very good point. Thank you, Azrael. And Kaylee, please share. Okay.
So I did some research. Latin American, Latine people in the US are generally diagnosed on average 2.5 years later, even if they are diagnosed. There's a lot of disparities in screening tools. I have data on Spanish, not in Portuguese. I'm trying to learn about that. I'm in Brazil.
Okay.
There was a study of 267 primary care pediatricians in 2013. It's a little dated. And only 28% offered autism screenings in Spanish. You know, so that's like one, yeah. So there's a huge disparity in getting diagnosis, also because of Latina people, and specifically Latina women, are the least likely to have health insurance of any minority group. I don't want to play misery poker and say one's worse than the other, but I think a lot of that has to do with immigration and a lot of poverty with Latina women. And also they're working, you know, blue collar house cleaning or even like underground economy jobs, and you don't get paid days off to like go to the doctor and go to another doctor and go to another doctor to get a diagnosis. And again, my blog post goes into the data and research on this. But like, you know, that honestly wasn't my experience. You know, I was kind of in a more upper middle class background, partially because my grandfather was a factory worker who died from poisoning from his factory. But he did save up enough money to leave my mom well off. But I guess like I only kind of figured out I was autistic like 34. But I got misdiagnosed multiple times, first with like depression, anxiety, then with like ADHD, you know, and bipolar. I still believe I'm bipolar to some extent, but it didn't ever fully, you know, explained who I was. So, you know, and then again, my mom still questions, oh, I think you're just like, you know, Yeah, why do you have to talk about being different? Why do you have to talk about being autistic? Why do you have to stand out? Because she was very much of the generation of like assimilation of like, you know, the nail that stands out gets hammered down, which is one reason she was taught to like embody white culture. And while she's fluent in Spanish, she was taught not to speak Spanish. So I didn't learn Spanish at home. You know, I'm trying to make up for that by living in Latin America, where I've been, you know, learning Spanish and a little bit of Portuguese for like 9 months. But like, you know, again, we keep talking about how like autism is generally considered a white disorder for so long. I mean, the earliest research on autism was literally of like parents of well-to-do scientists and a list of who's who in America. So yeah, we're so far behind in the Latina community, and not just in the US, but like in Latin American countries. I mean, it's so funny. I talked to my grandfather's doctor, who knew him for much of his life, and I was like, so I've been researching autism, and he has this trait, and this trait, and this trait, and this trait, and this trait. Plus, everyone compares me to him, and I'm autistic. Do you think maybe he was autistic? And his doctor was like, no, he was very good at talking to people. He can't be autistic. And I was like, wait, autistic people can be good at talking to people. That doesn't just automatically exclude you. But like, he was someone who would always excuse himself from a conversation and like go tinker with things in his workshop, you know, to get away from social situations. So, you know, that's scary.
That is so very interesting. That's kind of reminiscent of my life. I actually was diagnosed at the age of 46. So I've known of my diagnosis for 10 years at this point. I think the measure of trauma that I experienced was what kind of guided me through. I didn't really see trauma from autism because I didn't know what autism was. I didn't know I was autistic. And having to deal with this series of factors that I had to deal with, I will say, I think it was kind of unique that I had this ability to problem solve really well. So when you live in a situation where you don't know from one moment to the next what to expect, you learn how to navigate and you learn how to understand emotions. Like I could tell if trouble was coming my way, if my parents were really quiet, or if they were arguing really bad. And I knew that if they were arguing, that someone would have to take relief, get the relief from me, so that you know, I would have to get punished in some kind of way to make them feel better about what they experienced with each other or stuff like that. Or I had to be careful navigating around them. So I learned to be ultra aware about the people who were around me and picking up on different clues of that kind of thing. And then, you know, some people will say, well, autistic people, you know, aren't aware and this, that, and the other. But that's also not true, because sometimes we can be ultra aware of everything, even sometimes all at once, which can be overstimulating. In terms of gaining a diagnosis, I was actually sent to rule out, I was sent to get an assessment to rule out Asperger's, because the question came up of the possibility. And ultimately I did get the diagnosis. But the interesting thing is I'm a mom and my son is diagnosed with autism. And that process was what brought it very clear to me that there were some issues with getting people of color diagnosed. I started seeing traits with my son. Now, he was born at 7 months, so he already had a lot of other issues with development. But I started noticing traits with him when he was 2.5 years old. And I did some research. I did all the correct things. I took him to his pediatrician initially, who claimed he didn't, quote unquote, see autism. I signed my son up for every assessment that was possible to get access to in our area. We went to one of the leading, most renowned area organizations here. And as they were assessing him and we were talking, they were saying that he could see some of the traits. But when my son turned to me and blew a kiss to me from across the room, I was told right then that he could not possibly be autistic because autistic people don't do that. And so, needless to say, I fought until my son was 9 years old, when he was finally diagnosed. So he went through all those years of not getting any, formal assistance with that. I was just doing the best that I could, but it took that long to get a diagnosis, simply because my son didn't fit the quote unquote mold of what they were expecting. Well, I don't think he was going to, because what he was emulating was the way he grew up. We blew kisses to each other all the time. And we interacted, in a very loving and fun way. And he was very engaging, and he was very social, more so than me. So that made life difficult. But I think the biggest hurdle to science being so slow is that we are not involved in the process as much as we should be. I think that lived experience needs to be equal to scientific evidence, not something that's just haphazard. You just happen to ask 100 autistic people what that's like. I think there needs to be more said. I think that we need to be leaders in research about, our tribe, and see it from our perspective and be able to share that information. So I think that's very important. One last thing is, I would like to see science take a shift, and instead of trying to be experts at one small part of science, I think people should become experts about the scientific journey, because I think a lot is left out because we're focusing on such small parts of the aspect of being autistic that we're not really seeing the full picture. We're seeing more parts of people than the whole person. Okay, that being said, the second part to this question, and I have to pay attention to time because we're kind of running low on time. How does this play out with families, schools, and communities? And I would like for the panel to talk a little bit more about the expectation with families and communities and schools, if whether they knew or whether you knew you were autistic or not. And if we could, I'd like to start with you, Kaylee, and work my way around.
Well, I mentioned kind of being in like a gifted and talented program,
Okay.
which there's like this blessing and curse of like being seen as like high functioning, because high functioning often is a really harmful term because it assumes that someone who's like able to succeed in school, for example, or in their job doesn't need accommodations and supports. And as a result, I burnt out by like college, and I had severe health consequences the rest of my life, because I'd always been trying to compensate and always been trying to overcompensate and work more, to match my peers. And then, also something that comes with being quote unquote high functioning. I keep using this in quotes because it's a really damaging term, but it's really one of the only we have. The other problem with it is that like, I kind of still have like, imposter syndrome, like, am I really autistic? I still don't have a diagnosis because it's really expensive as an adult. And, I dealt with so many problems with not having accommodations in the workplace. And I actually had to bring a lawsuit against one of my employers with the National Labor Relations Board because we had a union, because I was so mistreated. And I became a union organizer to fight back against mistreatment, of people of color and disabled people at a nonprofit. We're not talking about like some big nameless corporation. We're talking about a nonprofit that literally had a disability justice mission. So like, yeah, again, that curse of being like high functioning, just really hurt. And I'm not sure if and when I'm going to get a diagnosis, but maybe, I wouldn't have severe physical health consequences from burning my body out. if earlier, you know, I'd been able to advocate for my needs, and eventually I left being like a salaried employee in the nonprofit sector and started my own consulting business and started traveling the world, because as an independent consultant, you know, I could set my own hours and, you know, set my own expectations. And luckily I'm talented and have enough connections that I've been able to make that work. But that's not for everyone to be able to start their own business, you know.
Right. That can be very challenging, very challenging. Could we move to Adriel, please? Thank you so much, Kaylee.
I'm just going to quickly talk about the,
Yes.
because of the way that my culture is different from what I grew up around, the assimilation kind of went out for a while, and caused me to mask a lot more than was healthy for me for an extended period of time. It's kind of wiped away a lot of experiences that I could have had culturally, because I was just trying to fit in for so long, because I didn't fit in as an autistic person, and I didn't fit in because of my skin color or my hair. There's the expectations culturally was never from my family unit or my personal culture. It came from the expectations of the exterior culture, technically, to me.
Okay.
And it just kind of, it's taken a long time to start to deconstruct a lot of those unhealthy expectations for myself, the ideas of the way I'm supposed to be independent, not expect help from other people, where that is not the culture that I was raised in. It's just the culture that I was steeped in, partially because the school system was better. The people who lived in that area had just more money, so the taxes went and gave people like laptops in schools earlier, stuff like that. And my parent wanted me to have those advantages when it came to education, but it did take a toll on me culturally. It separated me from understanding where I come from for an extended period of time. And it really is just how I masked for so long. And it wasn't even code switching, which is something that, because I just separated myself from it. I only was masking. I was only putting this idea of who I'm supposed to be in this culture above who I actually am, because I was just trying really hard to fit in a place that I didn't.
Wow, that is really something. I'll speak to that a little bit later because we're getting short on time. Audrey, if I could hear from you, please, and then Caitlin.
For me, I'm kind of echoing what Azrael said about masking, because I think within the Asian community, there's still a lot of shame and reluctance to identify as being autistic. And also there's this added pressure of like living up to the model minority myth as well. So like, yeah, if you don't live up to that standard, you're basically frowned upon, or like you're bringing shame to your family.
Okay.
And yeah, so as a result, it's really difficult to meet other autistic folks within the community. And I think a lot of Asian families are immigrants as well. So like, I think someone mentioned earlier about about translation, like having just making these resources more accessible to these communities. So yeah, I think for the Asian community, I think there's a lot to be done in terms of translating these the material into different languages. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Thank you, RJ. Caitlin, please.
I think a lot of what I noticed for expectations, I think, were different social skills or social awareness, which I mostly didn't have growing up. I don't know if I could say that I have it now. I think in a way I do think of like interacting with people who are neurotypical as a type of code switching, because I was getting the feedback of like, you need to make eye contact, or this is what you need to do when you talk to someone. So it did feel like I was just putting up a front in a different way around a different group of people. The same way with code switching of like, I talk with my family and friends a certain way that I wouldn't necessarily, in a way that I wouldn't necessarily talk with classmates or teachers.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Caitlin and everyone. I just wanted to add to that, that in my situation, very quickly, there were no expectations on me, but I don't think that had anything to do with the autism, because we didn't know autism was present. That was something that was forged out of the trauma and my parents' lack of involvement with me. Even though I grew up in a 2-parent household, it's almost as if I was by myself, because I never really, outside of disciplinary measures or the abuse, there was really very little interaction between me and my parents. So even with things in school, I was labeled a troublemaker because I didn't raise my hand in class and didn't respond to questions, even though I could beat everyone in the class if there was some sort of exercise or some sort of game or anything. So clearly I was learning quite easily, but I would oftentimes get punished even for that, because if I didn't participate in the class, then, then I would be punished. So just moving forward from that, just another quick question. Yes.
I just want to ask if you can look in the chat when you get a second. Thank you.
I did. I tried to nod and let you know that I acknowledged what you were saying without saying anything. Sorry about that. So I'm just kind of moving forward according to what I saw. The next question, and I don't know how much time we'll have, but just how can we overcome racial disparities that hinder access to autism-related services and supports? How do we ensure the work of disability and social justice movements are intersectional? And if we could just touch on that quickly. Would anyone like to volunteer to start?
I can start.
Thank you.
I think that a great simple way that we can do that is media representation, because a lot of it, the reason why it's really seen as like that white boy who just has difficulty talking to a girl, that's the way that it's represented in media. And there's a lot of good representation that's being started by actual autistic creators, but a lot of it doesn't get the traction that it needs. Or there's even whitewashing with The Good Doctor that happened, because that was originally a Korean drama that was really, really good and talked about the actual intricacies of autism, and they whitewashed it and changed some storylines and made it the way that media sees autism versus the way that autism is actually experienced. And like every time that I see something new, like, oh, this new autistic show, it's always a white man at the forefront of it, or it's a white woman, and there's never like the additive of even like a side character that's Black or Asian or has a cultural identity that's not usually like the very white Christian cis. There's nothing else. It's just they experience autism the exact same way, very Rain Man-esque. There's no differing support needs that are acknowledged. It's just the same exact formula.
Yes. Yes, I agree totally. Can I get one more answer before we move on? Who would like to share?
I think, oh, I'm sorry. I think I just had a quick, a really quick answer, like along the lines of like increasing representation. I think we have to create more, or we have to connect with the police and create more opportunities for them to learn more about how autism can manifest itself across different racial groups, and like,
Yeah, and different
not
cultures.
always this fixed identity, but can have many different kinds of autistic identities. Yeah. I think a lot of people are scared of coming out because of the police and what potential risks that it might entail. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. That's why my son and I both are involved with the CIT training in terms of allowing them to interact with one whose traits are more visible as opposed to one like myself whose traits aren't as visible. So it's something I encourage everyone to do. They really appreciate getting to know a little bit more, again, from the lived perspective. Caitlin, could I get you to please, if you could, share share your experience with this question, if I could?
Yeah, I think one thing that's important is honoring leaders of the past, like who don't get a lot of shine or tend to get ignored. Like one name that stands out to me is Brad Lomax. Like I feel like I recently learned more about his story and how he was a Black Panther and he was one of the leaders of the 504 sit-in in San Francisco for disability rights. And I definitely think recognizing current activists, because there
Yes.
are a lot of people on social media that like where things are whitewashed, but recognizing people who are at those intersections and the work that they're doing.
I agree. I agree. We have one more question, and to end this on a more positive note, what aspect of these intersectional identities bring you joy? And anybody who wants to chime in, we've got just a few more minutes. Kaylee?
I mean, it's definitely given me joy just finding other autistic people. Like in 2016, I attended my first kind of autism, event. It's like a gala, and I still remember like the name tags you got that were like green, yellow, red. Like red if you didn't want to talk to people, yellow if maybe, but only approach me if I know you, and then green like I'm willing to talk. And like that seemed really cool. Things like not being required to clap and like doing this. And it was like so weird because like I was like, wait, I hate clapping too, or like, right, like, wow, I like this stoplight, system, or and now it's been cool because I really find I identify with other autistic and neurodivergent folks, and it does make me feel far less alone. And I got invited to write an essay in a chapter in a little bit esoteric subject, but there's a book that's coming out called Crips, Crowds, and Cacophony: Disability and Heavy Metal. So like I'm writing a whole chapter essay on a book on like how goth subculture and metal subculture has created spaces for neurodivergent people for decades. And I got to interview like 53 neurodivergent people for this, and it'll be published soon. But it's really interesting, reframing. Oh, I was like a sad, lonely goth kid, and then I found community with a lot of neurodivergent people, and now looking back at it, being like, oh wow, those people are autistic. And I interviewed like 20 autistic goths doing this research, and it's been extremely fun. Although now I have to take a 9,000 word essay that was 15,000 words and I edited it down to 6,000 because I did so much research on it. But it's been really fun. And then I just want to add one more quick thing, which is like, there's always this expectation that like Latina people are like spicy and dance and samba and merengue, tango, and like that's great, but like I like goth music and metal. And I lived in Mexico, for like over a month, and then I lived in Sao Paulo for like 2 months. And do you know how many goths and metalheads live in Latin America? There's a lot. Do you know how many goth bands and metal bands are Latin American? There's a lot. It's not like all Latinos listen to, and are into Latin dance music. Like they also dance to like goth music. And that's been really cool to learn about.
Yeah, I bet. I like goth music too. We have time for one more answer. So who would like to take that? Azrael? Yes.
I'd like to jump in.
Thank you.
Even just like springboarding off of like the dance thing. In both my cultures, being Black and being Jewish, dance is a huge thing, and I skin dance. So like I'll put on something random, something like super weird. I end up in some really weird subgenres like glitch hop, and I just like move to the music, and it's like a really nice kind of spiritual, but also just like getting in touch with my body, stimming and
Yes.
releasing all of the energy from like any time that I need to, and moving, and it just kind of like brings me closer to myself as all of these things, and it's just such a nice, fun existence. And like I was a goth kid too. I feel like a lot of autistic people veer into these subcultures because they know that there's something off. There's something different about us that doesn't fit. So it's like, well, these people don't fit too. So I'm gonna do something like this, and we end up finding each other in these spaces, and I think that's beautiful.
It is very beautiful. And I think that was one of the things that I most loved. I was a bit of a rebel, and I think I still am a bit of a rebel. So whatever someone told me that I should be, I did the exact opposite. And I was always very happy to be myself. I really appreciate how my brain worked and what I look like and how I function and how I relate to people. And I love delving into the golf sector where, you know, I could sit and hang out with people and just talk about stuff. And most people think, you know, if you're goth, that all you talk about is like dark subjects and whatnot. And I had some of the most riveting conversations with some of the most brilliant people who were goth. So that's me, that's my thing. So it is just about 1:03. I think we have time for one more answer if someone would like to take that, and then we'll have to end. Caitlin?
Yeah, I can answer.
Great.
Similar to what Azriel shared, I had a lot of stemming through like music playing, especially with percussion or playing piano, which is technically percussion. And I didn't realize until my diagnosis that I have echolalia. So like I repeat sounds. And so that it just kind of made sense for me, like why I always really like rap music, because a lot of things are repeated, but I'll also mimic and repeat like whatever's been chopped and screwed or like whatever's been sampled that's repeating in the background, not necessarily the lyrics. So that's another way that I stem to and enjoy music.
Yeah, I love that too. I used to imitate sounds of different instruments. Okay, well, everyone, I just thank you so very much. RJ, we have a couple more minutes if you wanted to add something to this answer.
Sure, yeah, I think kind of similar to what everyone said. I guess being autistic, at least for myself, I think I'm able to focus on something for a very long time, or just having a very keen interest in something for a very long time.
Yes.
So it could be as simple as like listening to a song repeatedly over and over again. Yeah.
Yes, all day. I do a lot of that on the weekends. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for everybody being open and transparent about your experience. This has been a lovely conversation, and I hope that we might have a part 2. I don't know. We'll have to see, but I definitely think it would be worth doing this again. And I would love to have this conversation with you all again. Thank you so very much. And I turn it back over to T.
That was totally amazing, and you're right, Jackie. We got to do it again. We need a part 2. We did not get to do all of the questions we had for today, and it was really hard for us to pare it down to those questions. So yeah, I think we're prime. Yeah, and Jackie, Caitlin, Kaylee, RJ, as thank you just so much for everything that you put into the conversation today. Thank you for your vulnerability. I know it's a lot to put yourself out there. Just thank you so much. Attendees, thank you for listening today. We hope that this conversation provides you the opportunity to reflect on and grow the narratives you may hold around autism, race, culture, and their intersections. We hope you carry new understandings forward in your work with your families and with yourself. We have about, 7 or so minutes, and would welcome any questions that you all may have for the panelists. And again, you can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand through the reactions. While we're doing questions, we'll go ahead and put the link in the chat for DPS sign out. It sounds like some folks are wanting to know if you have any social media that you could follow. So if you all panelists have it, yeah, I see some of you are adding them in. Go ahead and add it in so folks can follow you.
Excuse me for one moment, please.
Cool. I'm not seeing any questions. Well, we appreciate you all being here. Our next one is on May 20th, and it's a Friday, so it's different than we usually do it. We're going to be discussing sex and sexuality, and we're really excited to announce that Lydia X.E. Brown will be in the conversation, as will be in this conversation as well. So really excited to do that one. Thanks so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.